This week on Talking Politics, what Starmer could learn from Trump.
Trump does optimism about the future of America. He rejects the narrative all over the West that we are trapped in decline.
Yeah. Ministers on collision course over Heathrow expansion.
One person told me Ed Miliband, the Energy and Climate Secretary, is incandescent.
The political fallout from Prince Harry versus the Sun's publishers.
There will be massive pressure for even another Leveson-style inquiry. This is all pretty momentous.
Hello, I'm Paul Brand, sitting in for Tom this week, who's been over in Washington for the inauguration of Donald Trump. And Robert and Anushka are here as always. Hi to both of you. So we should talk about Trump to begin with, shouldn't we? Because that has been the defining global story of the week. Robert, how's the inauguration going down in number 10? I think you were breaking some news this morning that Peter Mandelson will be confirmed as the US ambassador. It won't be blocked.
Yeah, so I understand that sort of noises have come out of the White House that have been reassuring to Downing Street and Mandelson himself. They had been concerned in the previous few days that because of his previous very negative remarks about Donald Trump, that the new US president would take steps to block him becoming our ambassador in Washington. I understand that the signals out of the White House is that they will allow Mandelson to take up his post. I think Mandelson is therefore planning to be there in a couple of weeks even. But despite that sort of, I mean, for Starmer, that is such a relief. It would have been so humiliating to see his appointee blocked in that way, almost without precedent. Nonetheless, it's been a very difficult, 24, 48 hours since Trump has laid out the full scale of what he is planning to do, and whether it's everything from imposing tariffs, which looks like they're going to start on Canada and Mexico, through to ripping up climate agreements, drilling, trying to sort of turn massively the taps up when it comes to oil and gas production, whether it comes to talking about, sounds like an invasion of Panama. I mean, pretty much everything he is saying, including the anti-woke stuff. There are only two genders he's going to legislate for in America. All of this stuff so antithetical to the values of a Labour government that you just struggle to see against, the backdrop of what he's planning to do, how the relationship can be special in a positive way, in the way that we've sort of taken for granted over the last half century. So, Starmer keeps talking about it's so important to work with Trump and America. It's not going to be easy.
No, and all the while he was surrounded by people who criticised Keir Starmer very publicly, not least of all on X, Twitter. Elon Musk, of course, was standing there for the inauguration, looked absolutely delighted throughout, jumping up and down and whooping. And that is going to be a challenge for Keir Starmer, because there are people within Trump's administration who are happy to take him on very publicly.
Yeah, I think there is a feeling inside Downing Street of buckle up, because this is going to be a bit of a wild ride. But they are trying to separate the types of problems that they're going to have. There is the bumpiness of Elon Musk, firing out tweets and criticising Keir Starmer. And of course, around Southport, they'll have been worried about that as well, because of what he was saying back in the summer. And they're trying in their minds to separate that out from what Donald Trump actually thinks, will say and might do. So there has been stuff specifically about the UK that Donald Trump has said with his drill baby drill policy. He's been very critical of us for trying to stop drilling in the North Sea. People inside Downing Street say to me, well, that's a policy difference. We can go with that. That's OK. They think that Elon Musk at the moment doesn't speak directly for Donald Trump. I mean, on tariffs, clearly there is worry about tariffs, although we do actually have a slight trade surplus with the United States. So in some ways, maybe somewhat more protected, even if they were to hit us, which it doesn't sound like they would start with anyway, compared to, say, China, where you can see huge problems. But the issue beyond all of that is, if there ends up being a trade war between the US and China, it's going to affect all of us.
The other big breaking news this morning, of course, Robert, is the hacking trial that Prince Harry has settled now with NGN, the owners of The Sun. What do you think this leads to now? Because we heard the lawyer, David Sherburn, for Prince Harry outside court saying he wants a parliamentary investigation and a police investigation.
And a new police inquiry. And we should just remind people watching and listening that the police are indeed actively considering whether to launch an investigation into alleged perjury by senior executives from Murdoch's news group during the initial investigations, the Leveson inquiry, court appearances, during the initial phase of outrage around phone hacking, also about perversion of the course of justice and destruction of evidence emails. These are things that the police, the Met Police, are actively looking at as right now, because Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, has asked them to do that, because quite a lot of, at least, well, a lot has come out in the vast numbers of cases there have been, civil cases in phone hacking over the last few years, which point to the possibility that indeed the law was broken back then. Now, in this apology today, one of the things that News Group admitted was that an allegation that they had made at the time against Tom Watson, that he had somehow been improperly obtaining Rebecca Brooks's emails, right? They're now admitting that was false. The reason that matters is because at the time, News Group told the police the reason they were destroying all those emails was to protect Rebecca Brooks from Tom Watson. Well, they've now admitted that excuse was a false excuse, and that is why both Watson and Prince Harry have said via David Sherburn, that they believe this police investigation has to now formally go ahead. So, this is all pretty momentous.
Yeah, and it's going to draw Parliament in as well, potentially, Anushka.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much to rake over and so much. I mean, there's admissions there, aren't there, over all of this period, and it's going to make it, I think.
And I think just on that, they'd never before admitted illegal activity by the Sun, right? And so there'll be lots of people saying, well, this should have been looked at, or all this information should have been given to the original Leveson inquiry. It wasn't. Right? The only admission they made of illegal activity was by the News of the World. They've always denied that the Sun engaged in it. So there will be massive pressure for even another Leveson-style inquiry.
Which, to be fair to say, that it will be interesting to see how Keir Starmer deals with all of that, because having once been quite a cheerleader for such things, he then went a little bit quiet as they tried to get the support of the Sun in the election, and successfully so. I
mean, it's widely believed that he had private conversations with News Group executives in which he basically said to them, we're not in favour of reopening any of these inquiries, as an attempt to try and get, the support of the Sun and the Times.
And that is quite a turnaround, because people who work in the Sun had really disliked Keir Starmer because of his role when he was at the CPS over all of this. And the turnaround that they've had in that relationship with the Sun has been quite dramatic. And I think to this day, they really care what's on the front of the Sun newspaper.
Although I have to say, if you look at it's very difficult to argue that the Times is exactly a cheerleader for the Labour Party at the moment.
Quite interesting. I mean, probably because of its editor, but they tried very hard with the Times as well and failed to persuade them to back Labour. And given the kind of difficulties they're now having with business, I think the Times probably feels that it made the right decision.
Although these days maybe it's the social media giants they really need to woo, right? I mean, the reach of Elon Musk is far greater than the
Elon Musk is definitely not listening to Keir Starmer when he's asking him to be nice.
His leader column ahead of the next election probably won't go Labour's way, I suspect.
It was another instalment of Starmer versus Badenoch at PMQs today, but what was conspicuously missing was any question about the Southport murders.
The thoughts of many will be with the victims of the Southport killings. There are important questions to answer, and I will return to those after the case is concluded.
Anushka, really interesting one, because it didn't really focus on what we had anticipated, which would have been Southport. In fact, Kemi Badenoch started talking about Southport and then said, but I'm not going to talk about that today, I'm going to talk about education. What did you make of it?
Well, it was a really weird reasoning for not talking about Southport, because yesterday they were complaining that we hadn't talked about Southport earlier and that the trial didn't need to stop us talking about it, and there were allegations that there'd been a cover-up, that the government hadn't spoken about things that they were able to. Keir Starmer's response to that was, I had to wait until we had this guilty plea in order to be able to prevent collapsing the trial. And today, she seemed to give that same reason. I'll speak about it once the trial is over.
Which with the sentencing on Thursday,
I thought it was
of course.
bizarre. I mean, I guess what they're thinking in part was, I mean, it's a litany of failures, yeah? We can see through this case a litany of failures, all of which happened when the Conservatives were in government.
Yeah.
So perhaps they felt it wasn't an area in which they could attack, although the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, had a good go at it yesterday.
Yeah.
Also, I think this issue, which obviously Reform has seized on, and as you say, Chris Philp, Shadow Home Secretary, also did talk about it yesterday, about how much Keir Starmer should have told everybody about, we now know that he knew that about the rice-in that had been made. He knew about the handbook, the Al-Qaeda handbook,
the referrals to prevent as well,
and the referrals. So he knew about all of this. Nigel Farage says this should have been made public. It looks like a cover-up. I think when Keir Starmer says, "Look, I took, I am a lawyer. I took advice about whether this would prejudice the trial." I think that's difficult for Kemi Badenoch, I think. I mean, does she really want to get into an argument about...
But they did yesterday. That's what's so odd about it, as Anushka says. Chris Philp, this was his line of questioning to the Home Secretary when she made a statement on it yesterday. Now, I do wonder whether the government is in a tricky position with all of this, and actually whether there are wider questions about reforming the way that we do release information. Because there was a window before charge for about 2 days, which I asked Keir Starmer about yesterday, where they could have released limited information, as we would in the media, when we're discussing a live case. If someone's been arrested, we generally would release some information about that person, whereas once they're charged, we know that the risk of prejudicing a trial is so much greater when we stop. So there was a window where maybe they could have said, we know he's not a Muslim, we know he's not an asylum seeker, which were two of the myths being spread online. But what we do know is he's a violent individual with a complex past who was referred to prevent, and he was a troubled character. Would that maybe have actually helped quell the riots, because you're providing people with an alternative theory for why he did what he did, rather than sort of this myth that, they're just dumbing down that he was X, Y, Z because they're covering it up.
Do we know how much they knew in that window?
I mean, they definitely would have known that he'd been referred to prevent. You assume they just would have done a quick search on him, right?
I mean, whether or not it would have quelled the riots, I don't know.
But I think that is a really important point. Those of us who are forced professionally to spend too much time on social media, it's altogether plausible that if they said that, essentially those people who mistrust everything that politicians say at the moment, or shall we say what they call mainstream politicians say at the moment, would have just said this is another cover-up. So
True.
just, if you live in a world where significant numbers of people don't believe a word that somebody like Keir Starmer says, would it really have made a difference?
But now we do know. And now I think we really do need to seize and talk about, how on earth they ended up with this litany of failures. I thought it was interesting that at the press conference you were at when Keir Starmer was talking about this sort of mirroring more what we see more regularly in America, the kind of kid goes into the high school and kills a lot of people. Whether if we think that is something that is on the rise here, how on earth we respond to that. And, obviously they've got the new kind of rules that they want to bring in around age verification, around buying knives on the internet. But it is a minefield. Yeah. Kids can get round age verification if they really want to do it. Someone talked to me once when I was talking about a whole load of issues that we have with technology and how children use technology, that it's very hard to overcome the smart 14 problem, which is that normally a 14-year-old will know more about the technology and how to get around it than you will. So I absolutely think we should be trying to do more on age verification, not just on this, just another example of something that's coming up. We're soon to get a review into porn and porn online, and there are almost no checks on children being able to see violent porn online.
That's definitely one of the big themes, is how online material is now influencing the generation of kids who grow up with this.
But just on that, the other thing, I suppose the phrase that I was most struck by, I don't know whether it stood out to you, you were at the Crest conference in Downing Street yesterday. So he does this chunk where he talks about the nightmare of being on social media. And then he says the problem is there's also a nightmare when you go into the real world, right? And obviously this is all connected to those appalling riots. But then he uses this phrase, which I just thought, I never really thought I'd hear a Labour Prime Minister said. He said, and that nightmare is not all about immigration and crumbling public services. And I just thought, and then he wants to go on and talk about other causes of collapsing social cohesion. But he does basically say part of it is at least to do with immigration and collapsing public services, which is a sort of, I just felt at the time when I heard it, I just thought, this is a sort of astonishing thing to hear from a Labour Prime Minister. I don't know what you thought, but it struck me that they're now sort of going in a reform-light direction.
Yeah, that was my assumption at the press conference, was that that was a bit of red meat for people who might be interested in voting for.
But is that really is that the way? But is that the way really to see off the threat of reform?
And it's also very different to the position they took during the riots, which was we are not going to legitimise the debate around immigration by what's happening here. This is basically violent thuggery, and that's how we're going to deal with it. But maybe they're getting more and more worried about, there was a poll that I was looking at yesterday, I think it's Delta poll from Joe Twyman. Labour are still ahead, but not far, and Reform are right up there. Yeah. And both Labour and the Conservatives are terrified of reform. Although, interestingly, someone who was speaking at an event where he was presenting this data made the argument, history shows us you can't out-reform reform.
Well, that's the point I'm making, really, in terms of doing the reform light. But also it takes us back to where we started, which is the significance of Trump. Now, as I said, there are a whole raft of policies that he announced that are basically toxic for any Labour government. But the other thing that absolutely stood out for me, and I'm sure it did for both of you, was that Trump does optimism about the future of America. He rejects the narrative all over the West that we are trapped in decline, right? And he does it in a way that has persuaded a majority of American voters to back him. And if you are a British leader or a French leader or a German leader, and you're not on the far right and the far left, you look at that and you say, goodness me, I wish I could do that. Because they are just incapable of doing it.
They do know that they need to be more optimistic. I mean, that whole last summer speech, I was there in the Downing Street Garden where it was like, things are going to get worse. They knew that the reaction to that wasn't positive and that people need a bit more optimism. And so I always
can't do it.
Well, I always think Keir Starmer needs to find the moment to basically show who he is as a Prime Minister and define himself. And I thought it might come after the Grenfell, not obviously the crisis itself, but we had an inquiry. We saw the kind of terrible, terrible reasons that led to the tragedy at the Grenfell Tower. And I thought he might come out there and be like, what I stand for is that everyone can live safely in their own homes, and that's what Britain is going to be under me. And then when I saw that he was doing a press conference on Southport, I thought, well, is he going to try and use this as his moment? Yeah. But watching it, I agree with Robert. It felt very pessimistic about our future, about what Britain is.
That's where charisma comes into politics, though, right? I mean, it's easy for Donald Trump, in a way, to provide this optimistic view because he has this force of personality. Does Keir Starmer have that? And we kept talking about it in the election. Does it matter whether someone has force of personality? It clearly does, doesn't it? Because I wonder whether we have seen who Keir Starmer actually is. This is him. He is just a relatively bureaucratic guy who likes to play by the rules, who believes that if you follow...
No, the guy we see is not the guy who the people who work around him and know him best describe. Like, definitely there is a gap between what you see and what people think he is like. Now, there are things about him which are probably quite loyally, and so the optimism isn't naturally there in a way that it might be for a Boris Johnson or it might be for a Donald Trump. But I think actually it's a problem for Downing Street that they are trying to overcome, which is how can they get what they believe is the real Keir Starmer out there.
I mean, I think, but it goes to the heart of the big judgment that he and his party made, which was the British people were just fed up with simplistic answers to complex problems, that what they wanted was a serious person who would do the work. And, there is no question that he is a serious person and he works very hard. The thing that should give all of us pause for thought is, whether the reason that they are unpopular is because, frankly, they have also made a whole series of misjudgments, right? But is it also that actually not enough voters care enough about sort of serious analysis? And he would say the reason he doesn't do the sort of flippant, it's all going to be great, kids thing is because that would be a lie, right?
Yeah, but I think also they think if you hold your nerve and over the years things actually improve, so NHS or, housing improves. Living standards improve. I mean, cost of living is still by a mile the thing that people are most worried about in this country. Actually, well above immigration, although for reform voters, immigration is very, very high. Then they think that maybe some good can come of it. The difficulty is these things are really hard to change. And as we've seen with them trying to make changes on growth and the OBR saying, no, we're not going to score that, it is difficult and it's a bit of a gamble in the meantime.
Can we just talk quickly about Heathrow, Anushka? Because, of course, the Chancellor said this morning that she hinted that maybe there will be a third runway after all under Labour. Yeah,
so there's been reports yesterday that she's going to use a speech on economic growth to basically greenlight the idea of multiple runways in the southeast, including in Heathrow. Well, I can tell you plenty of Cabinet colleagues were not aware of this. They said to me, look, Number 10 hadn't made a decision on this, conversations were going on, and there's going to be plenty of concerns across the board. One person told me Ed Miliband, the Energy and Climate Secretary, is incandescent, although those close to him said Ed is never incandescent. Rachel Reeves this morning has said this is the problem. So she's asked, if you push ahead with Heathrow, it might cause problems with Sadiq Khan, the London mayor. It might cause problems with Ed Miliband, the climate secretary. She says, this is the problem. This is the problem of the last government. There was always somebody that said, yes, of course we want to grow the economy, but we don't like that investment. We don't like that wind farm. We don't like those pylons. We don't like that airport. The answer can't always be no. But the thing is, behind the scenes, there is massive worry about this because there are other people who do not believe that new runways are the best place to actually generate growth at the moment. And the New Economics Foundation, by chance, had a report out yesterday that said if you put new runways in Gatwick, Luton and Heathrow, you basically make it almost impossible to hit our climate targets. The Climate Change Committee has been pretty clear that we're not in a position to go ahead with those. But just one other quick thing but just one other quick thing. The expansion's all in the southeast. What happened to levelling up? I know they ditched it as a phrase. Did they also ditch it as a concept?
So this just goes to the heart of, one of the fundamental flaws of this government, which they just didn't do enough preparation for government. They talked for a good year and a half before the election that growth was going to be the thing. It just turns out they hadn't worked out how to deliver it. And the advantage of Heathrow is this is, to use that awful phrase of Boris Johnson, it is oven ready, right? I mean, Heathrow has already spent £600 million.
This shocked them. Apparently at Heathrow, they had no idea this was coming. They were absolutely delighted.
That is true. They didn't know it was coming. But they've already spent £600 million on preparation, planning, buying up land and all the rest of it. It is one of the few mega projects that if the government says, yes, we will push through the environmental changes that need to go through. If we essentially push through on planning, the shovels will go in the ground, employment will be creation, and it's a £25 billion private sector project, right?
Judging by how fast some other projects go, we might have a new runway in 2060.
By the time the HS2 is completed, maybe.
Well, I'm told 10 years. I mean, it ain't going to happen in the lifetime of this Parliament, but maybe some jobs will be created. And that, the problem is, for all the reasons that Anushka has just said, right? If you're a Green government coming in. Right? This is like the last thing you'd want to do. But they haven't done the work on alternatives.
And what do you stand for? They stand for economic growth. They're making that really, really clear. But only a few years ago, as Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves said she wanted to be Britain's first Green Chancellor. Has that gone? Or does she still really care about that? And what do they stand for beyond the economic growth? What are they actually going to use it to do distributionally in the country? And so I think, I can see the economic growth arguments for going ahead with Heathrow, but clearly it brings a lot of worries around that cabinet table, and cabinet ministers are very worried about these comments.
And actually, the Green representation in Parliament is significantly greater than last time around. I
Four
know
MPs,
only 4 MPs, but nevertheless, that's 4 times more than the 1 MP there was last time there was a vote on this.
And they're doing pretty well in the polls.
Yeah,
they're a problem for Labour.
They're polling more than they've ever done, and they are a problem in a number of Labour constituencies.
That's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us. Tom will be back next week. In the meantime, you can catch up on all episodes of Talking Politics on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.